Okay, and it just gets better. Jeff, come on up on stage. Jeff Rulifson will come back. We're going to have a conversation about tools, and we have other panelists in this room. So Dan, where are you? Dan, come on up here, Dan. And Jeff?
He's coming.
Okay.
Okay.
Why are you in the back of the room? Okay, now, so get there. You just sit in the outside one, and Brett couldn't make it, but we're going to have a little demo of his.
So I actually didn't collude with Vint on this, but I plan to follow on. What we're going to try to address, Doug had many fantasies for NLS, which we did not get into the demo. There was actually some heated discussion about some of them. But one of the things that he was pushing on, even back then, was the idea that well, we've heard a lot about documents, and people produce a document, and then people link a document. And they make links to other documents. Doug wanted a kind of system where you could sit with your monitor or your display and your keyboard with other people and sort of resolve. He wanted the system to be able to help you not just think things through, but resolve arguments. And he had ideas about highlighting text in different ways and how the links would work so that you could use it sort of in facilitating the understanding to bring resolutions to heated discussions and things like that. And another idea that he had was linking documents together in such a way that the viewer would get a personalized view of what was going on. That is, if I looked at it, I would see something different than when Vint looked at it. And I actually implemented some facilities to do that. Nobody knows about them because they were totally unusable. And very confusing. And you had to be a extraordinarily skilled, educated computer scientist that could touch type code to make them work. Because you actually wrote the programs to direct the searches and stuff like that. So they never saw the light of day. Although some of the code was in the demo. So sort of playing on that, we've got Dan and Jeff here. And they've bent their pick trying to do these things. Broke their picks trying to do them. So what we're going to do here is have them each present what they've been working on, and then I'm going to try to, if I can, take what they're saying and have a little discussion with them to try to map it back into what I call bootstrap speak. If you think that HLAM-T is not well known and hard to understand, you should have had a lot of discussions with Doug, because he had hundreds of these wild ideas, and he had abbreviations for all of them. And I've always thought of that as bootstrap speak. So let's see, who wants to go first? Dan? Okay, go for it.
Hi. Doug understood deeply that we face extraordinary challenges, not just because the complexity and urgency of the problems we face are outstripping our capabilities, but because knowledge and capability is increasingly specialized itself. Really hard problems, think of the Fukushima nuclear incident, are increasingly only able to be solved by a smaller and smaller percentage of the overall population. Two concepts were key to his thinking. One we've heard about today, collective IQ, the community's ability to deal with complex, urgent problems. But the other was the DKR, the Dynamic Knowledge Repository, which was a living, breathing, rapidly evolving repository of all the stuff accumulating moment to moment for a community. Think of Wikipedia. Today I'll tell you about another kind of DKR, developed by a small group of noble individuals from different organizations working together over the last decade. So the problem is that right now, there's no easy way to know the thinking of other people about the world around us. There might be tens or thousands of people that might have read a particular article or book and inevitably a number of them will know a considerable amount about that subject, so that on this document or page or book or PDF that I'm on right now, how could I be informed by their perspective? And how could I tap into such a thing without it being an immediate vector for spam and trolls and the worst of everything online? We do have a thing now we call comments, but comments exist on only a tiny percentage of content on the web, considerably less than 10%. Comment widgets are put on pages and moderated by the people that own websites. Plus, comments are below the fold, proprietary technology that only allows a single layer of contributions. The system in one place is not the same as the system in another. They don't work on PDFs or ebooks. You can't be universally logged in. You don't own the comments you make. And you can't search them or tag them or make private ones for personal notes. And the fact that they exist on only a tiny percentage of content really renders them effectively useless. What we need is something we can carry around with us. What if instead we could annotate things? What if over every preprint on archive, for instance, you could see, if you wanted, layers of annotations from your scientific peers providing additional insights? What if over draft legislation coming out of subcommittee, you could see the annotations of citizen advocates and congressmen alike, providing close analysis of the passages that maybe we should pay attention to? What if over texts, like this poem, it's hard to read, by Edna St. Vincent Millay, teachers can invite students in to annotate not with words but with pictures the passages that inspired them? These annotations should be able to exist in layers, different layers for different purposes, groups, if you will, private, public, or read-only for special member communities. What if teams of hundreds of climate scientists, for instance, could work together in their own group layers to critique the factual coverage of reporting on global warming? It turns out they are. This article has been annotated together in a project called Climate Feedback that has received quite a bit of attention. But what if every community that is deeply informed about a particular subject could run their own distinct group layers over the web? It's not all about noble or academic pursuits. Here's a recipe for turkey soup that I like. I've made a note on it with some changes to the ingredients that I've arrived at. At the bottom, I pasted a YouTube video on Gordon Ramsay's most efficient way to dice an onion. What if any user could search their annotations across the web or the public annotations of any other user or group and against facets like tags and URLs with wildcards? All these examples are not only possible, but being done now at scale. Hypothesis, the nonprofit that I work at, hosts an endpoint of this open source software that services hundreds of thousands of users who've made about 4.5 million annotations, growing rapidly. This user profile page is for Heather on our team, who's now made tens of thousands of annotations, the vast majority of which are her own personal notes. You can go to our website and download a Chrome extension so that you can join the conversation. Free, no ads, no selling of user data, ever. It's all open source. Anybody can download it from GitHub, fork it, modify it, fix it, run an endpoint for their own purposes. Pull requests are welcome. But we can do more. What if every one of the 19 million books and texts in the Internet Archive could be the launch pad for a book club about its contents, like this copy of H.G. Wells' World Brain, or this original scan of Doug's 1962 paper? Or what about every book available through Amazon on the Kindle? Yeah, it may take a lot of convincing to get Amazon to build this in natively to the Kindle, but if you use the web reader, which is in your space in the browser, you should be able to lay annotations over those books. There are still a few tricky bits to get this particular use case to work, but we've got an early prototype that we're experimenting on. What if annotation clients were able to not just connect to a single monolithic server, but to multiple services? Spin one up, point people to it, and let them subscribe to it if they're interested. There are a million subreddits with billions of conversations, but from any given page on the web, you'd never know that. Creating an open scaffold for this to work is one of our biggest goals this year. To give you a more immediate example, this week when I was reading up on my history to prepare for this presentation, I was finding the old original famous articles that represent the history of digital annotation the way that we mean it, as a means of collective note-taking over knowledge. I kept seeing a reference to a 1965 article at TED's, so I went to find a free copy, but I couldn't find one. So I paid ACM the $15 for a fresh PDF, and I downloaded it. I began reading the article, which it turns out is also the one where TED first coins the term hypertext, and which, if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend. No, not the first one. I'll change my annotation. If you haven't read it yet, I totally recommend it. And for no surprise, for anybody who's familiar with TED's writing, it's beautifully written to boot. But I quickly wanted to be able to take notes and tag various passages so that I could come back to them later. So I dragged the PDF from my desktop to my browser and turned on the annotation client. Lo and behold, I discovered that it was already annotated. But not because those annotations shipped with the copy I downloaded from ACM. You see, every PDF comes with a unique hash, which is a sufficient identifier for the annotation engine to search against. The server returns the annotations for that fingerprint, and the client re-anchors them in real time. One of the annotations made last year by Roland Legrand is a note to read about Project Xanadu and to watch the Werner Herzog documentary, Lo and Behold, that includes a segment on TED. I added my own annotation anchored to this term zippered list, which Ted, let me know if I get this wrong, which was the first mention of a term later known as a xanological storage, and then transclusion, a concept which needs the ability to point specifically into any arbitrary place on the web, like an annotation. In this article, Ted also reflects on Vannevar's musing in As We May Think, which is probably the first real mention of digital annotation the way that we mean it. I added an annotation to his quote and linked it back to an annotation at Vannevar's original article at the Atlantic Magazine website, which over the last 4 years or so has accumulated about 157 annotations from dozens of people, including this one by Jeremy over Vannevar's original mention of marginal notes, which simply says, boom. I added one, replied to Jeremy there, and added an annotation that points back to Ted's citation, a bidirectional link. What would Doug's annotations over Vannevar's articles have been? And how could those, as Vint noticed, have pointed back to us as readers from the future? I know Gardner has created a Twitter account for his project called ENGELBART. But maybe there ought to be an annotation account called ENGELBART, which can annotate the key things on documents of the time that might have inspired Doug's work. From these early mentions, the notion of digital annotation evolved. In Tim's 1989 proposal, vague but exciting, that we now know as the web, he suggested that for CERN's purposes, you would need to be able to annotate links as well as nodes or pages. 4 years later, in 1993, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina built annotation right into the browser and called for some guinea pigs to test it. It had a very simple feature set, one group per annotation server, one annotation server per Mosaic session, no security except through obscurity. And to quote, it does work, and Mosaic 1.1 has built-in client-side support. They left it on for a couple months, and then after considerable debate, turned it off so they could focus back on the browser. That was the last time a browser has had native client-side support for annotation. Over the 25 years since then, there have been over 70 projects by our count, which have tried to bring some flavor of this over the web. Some of them you may have heard of, Third Voice, Reframe It, Genius, but none of these have caught on. I asked why and spent about a year interviewing people back in 2010 before Hypothesis. Why, from their perspective, from the founders' perspective, they hadn't quite crystallized. And the simple answer came that in order for this to be effective, it needs to be open, based on standards and not captured by any one single team or implementation. In 2014, a number of us got together and started a working group at the W3C with Tim's support. Last February, that recommendation for web annotation, which includes the formal data model, the protocol, and the vocabulary, was ratified by W3C membership. This allows interoperable clients and services to be built, very much like the web itself or email or IRC. Since then, we've put together a coalition of groups which have pledged to bring annotation natively to their platforms, which include a lot of open publishers, folks like JSTOR and PLOS and Whaley and folks you may have heard of. And we're looking forward to the future. So our mission to enable a conversation over all knowledge. Thank you for your time.
That's great. So, before we get Jeff started, it turns out we actually know what Doug's annotations on the article would be. The Computer History Museum has Doug's copy out of the original Atlantic, and there are pencil notes in the margin. So somebody in the Computer History Museum, Jake, could actually follow up and annotate the online version of the article with Doug's comments. That would be cool. Okay.
Let's do it, yeah.
Okay, Jeff. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. In the spirit of kind of rich, complex problems and social interaction, I woke up this morning having no idea what I was going to talk about today. So by way of introduction, it's really impossible. It takes me 10 minutes to explain this to people who know me well. So in addition to Doug, who inspired me about collective intelligence, I also was greatly influenced by Horst Riddle, a professor at Berkeley, who had come up with a system to help structure rich, complex conversations called IBIS. And so the other, and Riddle also came up with the term wicked problems. Just out of curiosity, how many people have heard of a wicked problem?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. It doesn't have anything to do with morality. It has to do with the ability of the people working on the problem to make sense of what they think the problem is. So it's pretty meta. So I was just blown away by this idea of IBIS as a structure of questions and ideas and arguments as a way to kind of a rhetorical grammar, a conversational structure for dissecting and displaying really rich, hard conversations among any number of stakeholders at any level of difference, and having it make more sense, having the display of this conversation in IBIS, at least, if nothing else, lower the tendency to have misunderstanding turn into hostility. So that's what I did for a couple decades. And and now I'm a handyman in Napa. So now you know. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard the old joke about the drunk guy who's staggering around under a streetlight. He's looking down. After a little while, another guy comes along and asks him, what's he looking for? My keys, says the drunk. The other guy looks down and starts looking around. Is this where you lost them? He asks casually. No, I lost them over there, he says, pointing off into the darkness. But the light's better over here. So I used to think this was a funny joke. This is cute. I now think it's possibly one of, excuse me, one of the most important parables in modern civilization. Because the keys, right? The keys represent something that is potentially of immense value to humanity and to the planet when you're talking at Doug's level of commitment. And the drunk guy, I don't think you're going to like this, but the drunk guy represents the computer industry. Looking mainly under the streetlight of profit and funding, creating technologies that are conceptually an easy reach within the current state of the practice. And so the point is, we mostly build tools that do what computers can do easily, not necessarily what humans need. And this, I think, is the summary and also the diagnosis for Doug's work and his frustration. Alan Kay's vision of interface as a learning environment. What a great example of something that is, of course, and yet, who tries to do that? And who's been successful at finding what the user is confused about because the language or the arrangement of things or whatever is not what they're expecting, and there's no model of this user, so the system just sits there and stares at them, and there's no possibility of learning how to use the damn thing unless you ask someone or spend a couple of hours looking it up someplace. So, okay, back to the metaphor. Occasionally, someone comes along who's so devoted to finding the real key that they're willing to look in the darkness. Doug was such a person. You know, a visionary, someone with good night vision. But it can be lonely out there looking for the keys, stumbling around in the darkness. So the smart visionary moves in closer to the streetlight, where the light's just good enough that you can do something, and maybe some of the other sort of nocturnal souls that are looking for these keys can find you, and you all can go to this kind of space at the edge of what's easy and obvious and work on it.
Get a flashlight.
Sorry, no flashlights allowed. Actually, flashlights are, I'll come to that later. It fits in the metaphor. Doug and his band of visionaries sensed that these keys, they're not, it's not just a quick, let's look around out here in the darkness thing to find the keys. They might be off in the deep underbrush over here. So they decided to do a very clever thing. They built a model of what the keys might look like. And that was the demo of 68. So the point of the demo, in this perspective, is to draw out the other searchers into the darkness where you don't know what's going on and you don't know what the problem is, and by the way, there's no funding, where the real keys had to be. So I was one of those searchers. I wasn't on Doug's team, but I had already found another visionary, this guy, Horst Riddle, that I mentioned. And he had created the IBIS system and coined the term wicked problems, and those two things just really sung to me, and I wanted to build a bridge between what Riddle was doing and what Engelbart was doing. So I set off down that path, and like I say, now I'm a handyman. So it's the challenge, as I see it, the challenge is to somehow equip ourselves, embolden ourselves to go into that darkness together, where the problems aren't simple. And in fact, let me just give you a little bit of a sense of what makes a wicked problem, because not everybody raised their hands. I don't know if you noticed. On a wicked problem, what the problem is a debate. There's no agreement about it. In fact, it can be a place of real conflict. It's a new problem. No one's ever solved anything like it. So there are no experts. There's nobody, you can't get on the phone and hire someone from a consultancy to come in and solve the problem for you. Generally, there's a long history, or at least some history, of litigation around this problem. That's one of the key markers. No litigation, probably not wicked. The biggest stakeholders are not at the table. How come? Because they're betting that whatever these group of people come up with as a solution to the problem fails. Because the biggest stakeholders are committed to the status quo. And it's not in their interest to have some bunch of yo-yos come in and come up with a solution that gets any momentum. Sorry, I can just feel the gravity settling in. And I know this is, I'm not waving the technology flag up here, if you've noticed. So I'm going to sort of stop there.
Okay.
And Jeff, I'm going to leave it to you to kind of bring people back, maybe.
I'll try. Okay, great.
Cheer us up and lead us on.
Okay, great. So let me stay on the wicked problem for a minute. I'm changing my thoughts around as I'm doing this. Pat Lincoln at SRI had a great way of talking about one of Doug's ideas. So you know, Doug often talked about working on the world's great problems. And I'm sure if I ask in the audience, what are the big problems that are facing us, I'd get answers. It's climate change, or a big problem is disease, and these are the world's big problems. Doug's big wicked problem was, how do we improve the way we solve wicked problems? And I think it has a lot of these characteristics. And in fact, I went out, I tried with Doug during the 90s to get funding from companies and stuff like this. And they were all enthusiastic about working on their problem. They did not want to work on how to improve the way they work on their problem. It was quite an interesting problem, and it still is. So he'd appreciate the wicked problem issue a lot. I had an idea when Dan was talking about, I wanted to go into bootstrapping about that, but there was another idea that hasn't been talked about here at all that Doug had. Doug saw text and the manipulation of text is the thing we could do in 1968. His insight, actually going back into the late 50s, the fundamental insight was all of the media that we deal with in the world is going to become digitized. And audio, even smell, although we used to argue about that a lot. And as video and audio becomes digitized, there's no need to treat it the way that we treat it. You don't have to manipulate text like you were manipulating cutout things to put a paper together, and you don't have to compose music that can be played by people, and you don't have to have videos that have people in them. And as we go through that transition, we're actually going through part of Doug's vision of going from what we could do with mechanical media into a world that we can live in where everything is digitized. Alan had picked up on this. Alan is an expert organist, and when you can score your music using computers and you can play it on computers, you don't have to stick to 4-part fugues. You can have 7-part fugues, and do stuff that you couldn't do. We only have 3 minutes. With hypothesis, I want to dive in 3 minutes into the ABC example. Does the hypothesis team use hypothesis in any way when they're building hypothesis?
We use it internally to take notes and over many different kinds of things. We don't use it necessarily as a fundamental part of the software development process.
Right.
But we use it as part of maybe the conceptual thinking about how we do it.
So there we have a good example of the first stage of bootstrapping. This C-level thinking that Doug would talk about, and the answer may be negative here, is have you ever gone through a process of using hypothesis to improve your long-range plans for hypothesis, or the way to improve the way you're improving hypothesis? Have you had discussions on that level?
I mean, to the extent that when the thinking itself around product, what our plans are and forecasts and things like that are appropriate for the kind of annotation that we're doing, yeah. Although, we use a lot of Google Docs too, and Google Docs has a great little annotation, native annotation capability in it. And I mean, the thing that struck me this morning and listening to the conversation you guys were having about the making of the demo was what an extraordinary experience it was to be building all the tools necessary from the ground up. The meta compiler that needed to be written first in order to be able to get there, and the kinds of opportunities that projects that are susceptible or need that kind of ground up architecture are pretty interesting. These days we have so many open source modules that we're grabbing, that happen to be on GitHub that we just kind of bolt together along with some other code to do the things we're doing. It's a different, in some ways, a different.
So I'm sort of pushing on this really to demonstrate that these ideas that Doug had it's easy to get through the A-level work and the B-level work, but getting into the really deep C-level work and the bootstrapping process that goes on behind it is even extremely difficult for people that are building the right kind of tools and know what they're doing. Okay, I think we're done. And we're on time again. Okay, thank you.